Calico Ridge was a place where the wind never stopped blowing and the dust seemed to remember every boot that passed through. A cluster of sun-faded wooden buildings sat crooked along the single main street, surrounded by desert hills that turned to fire at sunset. A church with a cracked bell, a saloon with a leaning sign, and a general store with a dog always asleep on the porch. This was the whole of it. Life moved slow in Calico Ridge, just the way its folks liked it. That is, until trouble came riding from the east. At the far end of town stood a blacksmith shop, its stone forge always breathing smoke and heat. The man who worked it was Elias Boon, a name folk spoke with more discomfort than respect. He was thick in the shoulders, his neck like a tree stump, hands so big they looked like they could bend railroad ties instead of horseshoes. His eyes were deep-set and unreadable, and his voice, when it came, was gravel poured over silence. Most days he didn't speak at all. Children didn't dare run near the forge. They claimed he had a demon's face, with that burn along his jaw and the strange way his right eye didn't blink like the left. Women would leave food at his door sometimes, wrapped in cloth, but few had the heart to stay long enough for thanks. The men of Calico Ridge, ranch hands, traders, miners, laughed when they thought he wasn't listening. Said he was touched in the head, too dumb to speak, too slow to shoot. He's good for ham errant shoes and wrangling donkeys, they'd snicker at the saloon. But if you ever needed a man in a fight, hell, you'd be better off throwing a horseshoe yourself. Elias never answered. He'd just keep hammering, the sound echoing down the empty street like a heartbeat no one wanted to talk about. His shop was dark inside, save for the glow of the forge. Iron tools lined the walls, each in perfect place. On a high shelf, covered in soot, sat an old oilskin trunk with a rusted lock. No one ever saw it opened. On the mantel above his workbench lay a stack of letters, edges curled with heat. Once, someone saw him burn one, tossed it into the fire with a strange calm, the wax seal bubbling before the flames took it. There were scars under his apron, the kind no accident with a bellows would leave. Sometimes at night, he'd sit outside and stare at nothing, the stars reflecting off something deeper in him than any town gossip could reach. The morning the gang rode into town, it was hotter than usual. The sky hung heavy, and the sun had a mean glare in its eye. 5 of them, dust-covered and grinning wide with guns on their hips, rode straight through the street like they owned the place. Vultures scattered. The townsfolk froze in doorways. Sheriff Bixby was nowhere to be seen. Most guessed he'd gone back to drinking behind the post office. They didn't shoot anyone. Not yet. Just laughed loud, spat on the ground, and tied their horses like they planned to stay a while. The biggest of them, a red-bearded man with a scar across his mouth, walked straight into the saloon, knocked a man off his stool, and took his drink. Another swaggered out toward the blacksmith shop, curious. Elias was outside, his arms black with soot, hammering out a new shoe for old Mayor Tully's mule. He didn't look up when the gang member stopped beside him. "Well, I'll be," the outlaw drawled, eyeing Elias like he was a bear in a cage. "Ain't you the biggest ox I ever saw? What they pay you to stand here and sweat, huh? Or do you just like the sound of your own hammer?" No answer. The hammer rose and fell again. Sparks danced. The moon grinned wider. "Heard this town's got a reputation for cowards. Guess you're their statue." He picked up a finished horseshoe from the rack, pretending to weigh it, then threw it like a frisbee into the dirt. Laughed. When Elias still didn't look at him, the outlaw leaned in close. "You even got a tongue, muleman." Elias paused, lifted the hammer, and set it down gently on the anvil. Then he looked up. His eyes didn't flicker with rage. They didn't tremble with fear. They simply looked, like stone remembers fire. The outlaw stepped back before he knew he was doing it. "You might want to put that horseshoe back," Elias said, voice low, calm, and slow as thunder over far hills. The gang member blinked, confused. "What?" Elias didn't repeat himself. He turned back to his work, as if the men were no more than a gust of wind. The outlaw stood there a moment, jaw shifting, unsure what he'd just felt. Then he spat near Elias's boots and walked off, muttering something about old freaks and rusted brains. From the saloon window, men watched. From the general store porch, an old rancher chewed slower than usual. No one said anything. But in the silence that followed, something had shifted. The blacksmith had spoken. Just once. But it was enough. Because in Calico Ridge, Elias Boon had never spoken to anyone like that before. And in the desert wind that carried on, there was something new. Not fear, not pity, just a hush. Like the land itself was waiting. Red dust clung to his boots like regret. The wind on the mesa howled with a voice too familiar, too much like the cry that had once ripped from his own throat. Elias stood there, hat in his hands, his figure tall against a sky smeared in twilight blood. Beneath his feet, the earth was scorched with the memory of violence, a dried patch where the grass never grew back, where 6 men had once stood and only one walked away. The grave was unmarked, save for a single iron horseshoe bent into a crude circle and hammered flat into the dirt. Elias had made it himself the night after the gunfight, hands shaking, face what was something he wouldn't name. He didn't believe in gravestones. Stones could lie. They wore names that grew cold, but iron remembered heat. And his brother Mason had been all fire. The sky above flickered, lightning miles away but seen. Elias knelt, his knee grinding into the sand, and placed a worn cartridge on the grave, one of the 6 he hadn't fired that day. It had sat in his coat pocket for 13 years. Always with him. Like Mason had been. "I told you not to come with me," he whispered. "Told you I'd be the one to carry it." His hand trembled for only a moment before it curled into a fist. "You damn fool. You always wanted to believe people could change." He stood, heavy in frame but light in step, the way a man moves when every part of him is scar tissue. Behind him, the forge still smoked in the shop yard below, far across the edge of the ridge. The desert night began to fall, and with it, so did memory. 13 years ago, that same mesa had boiled with heat and gunpowder. 6 pistols, 5 dead men, and Mason, his twin, his better, bleeding from the gut as he laughed in Elias's arms. Said something about a horse named Clementine. Said something about finishing a letter to their ma. Then nothing. Just the sound of the West taking something back. Elias had carried him down, dug the hole himself, and disappeared into the forge. Became a mun of tools, not bullets. No one in Calico Ridge ever asked why the blacksmith had such precision in his hammer strikes, or why his hands didn't shake around molten steel. They figured he was just simple. Safer that way. But safety had a short lifespan in Calico Ridge. The gang came back 2 days after Elias had been mocked in the street. Not just to ride through this time. They fired pistols into the sky, shattered bottles outside the saloon, and made a show of grabbing a young woman by the wrist in front of her father's shop. The father did nothing. He had 3 other kids and one eye. He made a choice. Inside the jailhouse, Sheriff Bixby was halfway through a bottle of rye, muttering something about goddamn rattlers and long roads to nowhere. His badge was dull, his holster dusty. When Elias knocked quietly on the doorframe, the sheriff didn't even raise his eyes. "Locks rusted clean through," Elias said, voice low. "Won't hold a drunk, let alone a mun with teeth." Bixby waved him off. "Ain't no need. They're just boys blowing dust. They'll move on." Elias didn't argue. He walked to the back, fetched a file, and quietly began shaping a new bolt from scrap. It took less than an hour. His hands never paused. When he returned to hand it over, Bixby was already asleep, arm draped over the desk like a dead man taking a nap. By afternoon, the gang had decided to settle in. Their leader, Cutter, wore a buffalo coat and eyes like dry bone. He didn't speak much, didn't need to. The others followed him like wolves trailing blood. One of the younger ones, a wiry boy with straw blonde hair and a constant twitch, wandered toward Elias's ford just before sunset. Elias was stoking coals, shirt soaked through with sweat, chest heaving from the bellows. The boy leaned on the open post and grinned. "Old man," he called, flipping a bullet between his fingers. "How hot's that fire get?" Elias didn't respond. The boy grinned wider. "Reckon a slug cooked nice in there, huh?" Before Elias could move, the kid flicked the bullet into the forge. A moment passed, nothing. Then, with a scream like metal tearing flesh, the forge burst. Coals blew out in a wave, embers like be scattering into the air. A pipe split. The side wall blackened. Elias dropped, shielding his eyes. A shard of glowing iron shot past his ear, slicing the air. Laughter erupted behind him. Not just the boy, but 3 others nearby. Townsfolk gathered at a distance, unsure whether to watch or run. No one stepped in. When the smoke cleared, Elias rose slowly. His apron was singed. His left arm red from heat. But his eyes, those changed. Not rage. Not pain. Just quiet. He turned, walked past the boy without a word, picked up the horseshoe the kid had kicked earlier, and began hammering it anew. Each strike came slower, deeper. The sound echoed too loud for the distance. The boy faded back into the crowd. That night, the town slept with one eye open. Elias didn't sleep. He waited until the moon was high, then left his door unlatched and walked behind the forge, past the barrel of rusted nails, past the wagon wheel buried in wild sage. He knelt beside the grave. No firelight, no lantern, just the moon and his breath. "Mason," he said, voice nearly lost in the wind. "They're here." He set the cartridge down again, this time not as offering, as promise. They laugh like they've never seen a grave up close. That'll change. The desert wind kicked up, rustling dry leaves and whispering through the brush. Elias listened, like maybe Mason would answer. Nothing. Only silence. He stood and placed a calloused hand over the flat horseshoe. "I'll be you tomorrow," he whispered. "Just for a little while." The wind carried that vow, twisting between the canyon walls like a secret waking up. Back in town, no one noticed the forge's fire was never relit. The anvil cooled. The hammer slept. But deep beneath the floorboards, inside that oilskin trunk, the twin pistols of Elias' six-shot Mason waited in perfect, deadly stillness. By the third morning, Calico Ridge wasn't the same town it had been. The gang had taken up residence like a sickness in the bones of the place, quiet at first, then spreading. Cutter claimed the saloon's upstairs rooms as his quarters. The others scattered like foxes in a hen-ice. One slept behind the general store, another in the stables, two more in the church's empty vestry. Sheriff Bixby hadn't been seen since his rye bottle ran dry. They called it protection. Said it with grins that didn't touch their eyes, walking into shops with their guns unbuckled and their boots on counters. $10 a week, every Monday, or else something might accidentally catch fire. The old barber refused, lost his mirrors and 2 teeth before the day was out. The preacher said no, too. They burned the psalm books and left a bullet in the offering tray. By Wednesday, even the undertaker paid. But Elias Boon did not. They came to him late afternoon, sun low and mean, heat coal tight above the rooftops. He was at his anvil, shirt soaked with sweat, hammer rising and falling in rhythm with his breath. His arms gleamed with dust and effort, veins thick as rope. He didn't look up when they approached. 3 of them. Youngbloods with too much smile and not enough past. "Big men," one of them said, a wiry fellow with crooked teeth. "Seems you forgot to leave something in the pot this week." Elias didn't answer. The ring of steel striking steel echoed sharp into the street. Another step closer, towing a bucket aside. "Maybe he's deaf. Or dumb." "You dumb, blacksmith." The Fed laughed, lifted a tin cup from the edge of the forge, filled it from Elias's canteen, and spat into it. Thick and slow. Then he set it down on the bench beside him, right where Elias would reach next. "You think you're above it, huh? All big and sweaty, swinging hammers like some goddamn mute giant." Still no answer. Elias picked up the next horseshoe, placed it in the fire, watched the iron redden like an eye-opening. The wiry one shoved him in the shoulder. It was like pushing a tree. "You got something to say, say it." Elias didn't flinch. Just pulled the shoe from the coals, set it on the anvil, and began shaping it. Sparks burst up in a flurry, scattering around his boots. The third one leaned in close. "Don't talk to us now, old man. You'll be begging soon enough." He knocked the spit cup off the bench. It clanged and rolled. Still, Elias didn't look at them. He hammered again. They stood there a moment longer, waiting for him to break. He didn't. Eventually, they walked off, but not before the wiry one dragged his knife across the side of Elias's shop, deep, slow, marking the wood like a promise. When they were gone, Elias let the hammer rest. He picked up the tin cup, held it for a second, stared into the spit clouding the water. Then, without a word, he turned it over and let it fall. Later that evening, when the forge had cooled and the town tried to sleep through its shame, Elias found something strange near the back of his shop. A movement in the shadows. A flicker of breath. He didn't say anything. Just waited. From behind the barrels of old nails and chain links, a boy crept out. Thin, dirty, eyes wide with hunger and something deeper. Feel like Elias had only seen on battlegrounds. The boy was no older than 10. Maybe less. No shoes. Scraped knees. Clutching a small burlap sack like it held his entire world. Elias said nothing. The boy didn't speak either. Just stood there, shaking. Elias walked past him, poured a tin of water, placed it on the bench, and returned to his corner. He stoked the fire low, Not for work, just for warmth. The boy stared at the cup for a long time before stepping forward and drinking. That night, he curled up near the forge on a pile of old canvas. Elias didn't ask where he came from. He didn't need to. The next morning, word spread about a raid in Dust Hollow, a neighboring town 2 days west. Half the buildings gone. Church burned. Families shot trying to run. Survivors scattered. Some never even got names. The boy had won, probably. But Elias didn't ask. He gave him food, handed him a small hammer, and pointed to the bent nails in the corner. The boy worked in silence, but his hand steadied with each passing hour. For the first time in days, the forge didn't sound lonely. Outside, the town watched, whispered, wondered. "He's got a kid in there," a merchant said, peering through the smithy window. "Probably some orphan from Dust Hollow." "Why is he feeding him?" asked another. "Man can't even feed his own future." A third shrugged. "Maybe he's cracked for good." But in every room, every porch, the question turned quieter. Why doesn't he fight back? They remembered how he just stood there as the gang spit in his drink. Remembered how he never looked angry, never raised a hand. Just kept hammering like nothing could touch him. In the corner of the saloon, old May, who'd buried 3 husbands and seen the railroad come through, then leave, rocked in her chair and took a slow pull from her pipe. "Y'all are fools," she said vinily. They turned to her. "Think a bear don't move 'cause he's scared?" She shook her head, smoke curling from her nostrils. "He don't move 'cause he's waiting. You don't wake a bear with a stick unless you've said goodbye to your teeth." No one laughed. The next morning, the boy was still in the shop. This time he held a coal tongs, passing Elias hot metal as the blacksmith worked. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Outside, the gang passed by again. Cutter at the head, silent as death. He slowed his horse just long enough to glance inside the forge. Elias looked up, just once, and their eyes met. It was brief. But in that moment, the heat from the forge felt colder than the desert wind. Cutter didn't smile. Just turned his horse and rode on. Inside, Elias turned back to the fire. The boy stood beside him, face smudged, fingers black with soot. Elias handed him a file. The sparks flew again. The hammer sang. And Calico Ridge, for the first time in weeks, began to hold its breath. Rain hadn't touched Calico Ridge in nearly 6 weeks, but that day, the sky hung low with a promise no one wanted kept. Thunder murmured on the edge of the horizon as if deciding whether the town was worth the trouble. The air smelled of iron and old sweat. Nothing moved, not even the wind. The schoolhouse bell rang once before it shattered. Miss Penelope Cartwright hit the dirt hard, spun by the slap of a gang member's fist. Her hand scraped the gravel as she gasped, blood already blooming from her lip. The children had scattered like startled birds, fleeing through windows and hedges, barefoot and silent. She didn't cry out, just pushed herself up on trembling arms, only to be knocked down again. Cutter stood watching, arms folded, eyes flat. One of his men held her lesson book high, then tore it in two and tossed the pieces into the air like shredded leaves. "Preachin', numbers don't fix nothing," he sneered. "Time this town learned that." The townsfolk gathered in a loose ring, held back by fear more than decency. They watched, too still, too quiet. No one moved. Except Elias. He stood near the back of the crowd, arms folded, apron still dusted with coal. His face didn't change, not even as she cried out the third time. His eyes were steady, unblinking. Watching, not hiding. And when it was over, when Cutter turned his back and the schoolteacher crawled toward the chapel steps, broken but alive, Elias walked away. Said nothing. That night, the sky split open. Lightning carved white veins across the desert. Thunder came in slow, lumbering rolls. Rain fell like it had waited years to find this place. Hard, angry drops soaked the sand, filled boot prints, and rattled the shop roof like fists demanding entry. Behind the forge, the ground grew soft. Elias dug without a lantern, without hesitation. Water streamed down his neck, plastered his shirt to his back. His shovel bit earth with the familiarity of ritual. Each thrust was deliberate, measured, the kind of digging done by someone who already knows what lies beneath. It took time. The grave had settled deep with the years. Roots had crept through the soil. Rain made mud of the memories. But eventually, the metal edge struck something solid. He dropped to his knees and brushed the earth away with his hands. A saddlebag, thick with age, pulled from the ground like a coffin's breath. Elias opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and silence, lay a cold peacemaker, grip worn smooth, barrel dark with history. He ran his fingers over it like touching an old scar. It was still perfectly oiled. Still ready. Beneath it, a tin box. The latch rusted but intact. He pried it open. A badge rested inside, dulled but recognizable. U.S. Marshal. Its edges were stained with something too dark to be rust. Next to it, folded with painful precision, was a wanted poster, creased and yellowed. The ink had bled in spots, but the name was still clear. Elias Six-Shot Mason. The face staring back looked too much like his own. Because it was. The town never knew. They saw a brute with calloused hands and a quiet mouth. A blacksmith who said little and wanted less. They never asked why his scars didn't match the work, or why he walked like a man who'd been trained to shoot before he learned to speak. The man they thought they knew, Elias Boon, wasn't the one buried in that grave behind the forge. Mason Boon had been the good one, the quiet twin, the one who read scripture instead of drawing steel. When the war ended, Mason wanted peace. Wanted to buy land and raise horses and maybe open a school for orphans like the ones they'd been. He begged Elias to bury the guns, to bury the name Six-Shot and leave it all behind. Elias had agreed. And then Mason died instead. Wrong place, wrong gunfight, wrong bullet. Elias had dug the grave, taken his brother's name, worn his apron, built a life in the silence Mason had always loved. He traded bullets for anvils, law for iron, but the ghosts never left. Now they were here, wearing faces of men who thought pain was a sport and justice a punchline. The boy in his shop, the one with eyes too old for his age, deserved more than silence. The town deserved more than waiting. He placed the badge back in the tin, but this time tucked it in his coat pocket. The peacemaker he holstered at his hip. He stood in the rain, water running in rivulets down his arms, the cold heavy but right. Thunder cracked again, close now. The forge behind him still smoked from the day's fire, like it had known what was coming. Elias walked to the grave and knelt. His fingers traced the horseshoe embedded in the earth. His mouth moved with effort, words catching on years of rust. "Time to wear your name again, brother," he said. "Just once more." He bowed his head. The lightning struck again, illuminating the forge, the anvil, the place where iron met purpose. Then he rose. Not as Elias Boon the blacksmith, but as Elias Mason, the man whose legend had never quite died. The sky cracked open over Calico Ridge in hues of deep rose and burnt gold, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dirt street. A hush sat heavy on the town. Not the quiet of peace, but the silence before something breaks. Hooves beat the morning stillness as the gang rode in, their laughter sharp and hollow. Dust kicked up behind them like smoke trailing a fire. They swaggered through the heart of town, guns slung low, daring someone to challenge them. No one did. Until the hammering stopped. It had always been there. Steady. Relentless. The heartbeat of the forge. For years, it had echoed off the wooden walls of Calico Ridge like a lullaby sung in iron. Now it was gone. The gang slowed. From the far end of the street, a man appeared through the settling dust. He wasn't hunched over or wrapped in soot. His face was clean-shaven, jaw cut like granite. His eyes, they were a kind of cold the desert didn't make. He wore a black duster, weathered, faded at the seams, and every step he took was silent, like death walking on soft feet. The people of Calico Ridge stepped out of their homes and shops, drawn by the quiet, drawn by the finality in it. They lined the porches and leaned against posts, mouths dry, hands trembling. They knew what they were seeing, even if they didn't have words for it. The men stopped in the center of the street, the rising sun at his back, and faced the gang like he'd been waiting since birth for this moment. Vance Cutter narrowed his eyes from the saddle, lips parting in confusion. "Who the hell?" "Elias Mason," the men said, voice calm but firm, each syllable as deliberate as a bullet. Cutter's jaw twitched. "That's so. Funny. Heard you were dead." Elias didn't blink. "I was. Now I'm what's left." The gang shifted uneasily in their saddles. Something about the way this man stood, how still he was, how unafraid, unearthed something old and instinctive in their blood. Cutter laughed, but the sound cracked. "You're the blacksmith." Elias stepped forward, slowly, hand resting at his side. "You mocked a blacksmith." Another step, but buried a legend. The townsfolk stilled. Even the wind seemed to hush. "Six-Shot Mason," someone whispered. Cutter scowled. I've killed quicker men than you before breakfast. Not today, Elias said. It happened fast. Too fast. The first outlaw reached for his revolver, but his hand never made it past his hip. Elias's Colt barked once, and the men toppled backward, lifeless before he hit the dirt. Another tried to circle left, gone before he drew. A hole in his chest, clean as a nail punched through paper. Screams rang out. Horses reared. Townsfolk scattered behind barrels and railings. But Elias stood unmoved, boots planted like anchors in time. A third outlaw got off a shot, wild and high. Elias pivoted, fired, dropped him cold. 4, 5, 6. They fell like wheat under a scythe, precision in every pull of the trigger. No wasted motion. No wasted breath. Cutter's horse bucked beneath him as the leader tried to flee. He spun the beast hard, bolting for the edge of town, but before he could vanish, Elias raised the Colt one last time. The gunshot echoed like thunder through the morning light. Cutter screamed, pistol spiraling from his hand, clattering uselessly in the dust. The horse threw him. He landed hard, rolled, and lay gasping on the ground, clutching his bleeding wrist. Panic had taken his voice. Elias walked toward him slowly. Not as a killer. As a reckoning. He stopped just short of the broken men. Looked down at him the way one might study a rattlesnake with no fangs. Cutter's lips moved. No words came. Elias holstered the Colt. I'm not your executioner, he said. Tone as steady as a river. But I won't clean up after you, either. Then he turned and walked away. The people of Calico Ridge emerged slowly. First one. Then another. Eyes wide, mouth slack, hearts thundering. The blacksmith had vanished. What stood there now was something older. Something the West hadn't seen in a long time. Justice. Not the kind written in books or worn on drunken sheriffs. The kind carved by memory and loss. The kind born from a brother's grave. Elias Mason didn't speak again as he walked past the forge, where the fire had long since died. It never sang again. The smoke from the gunfight lingered longer than the bodies. Calico Ridge did not speak of the violence in loud voices or over drinks. It settled into the wood of the porches, into the dusty silence of their morning routines. No one touched the corpses. No one dared. By sundown, the wind had covered most of the blood with sand, as if the desert itself wanted the memory buried quick and deep. Life began again in whispers. The saloon swept up its broken glass. The general store unlocked its shutters. The schoolhouse, though its bell never rang again, reopened with children tiptoeing inside as though the walls still remembered screams. But none of it returned to what it had been. People moved with cautious reverence, like they were living in a church that had once held judgment. And at the end of the street, the forge burned once more. Elias Mason returned to the anvil in silence. The boy was still there, watching, always watching, with soot on his cheeks and questions in his eyes. He never asked them. Just fetched coal, passed tongs, swept the floor. He worked like a shadow beside the men who'd given him a place when the world had turned to ash. Elias didn't speak much. Didn't need to. The forge sang again, but not with the wild, thunderous rhythm it once held. It was softer now. Measured. The kind of sound that healed rather than warned. The jail door had been half torn from its hinges, the lock busted open during the days the gang had ruled. Sheriff Bixby reappeared after the bodies were gone, staggering out of whatever hollow he'd been hiding in, too ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. He found Elias working in the morning mist, shaping steel with the boy beside him. The sheriff cleared his throat. Elias didn't look up. He just said, "Lock's ready." He handed over a key. A new bolt gleamed in the morning sun, stronger than the last. Bixby took it with shaking fingers and turned to leave, but Elias stopped him. "You don't need to wear the badge," he said, voice calm. "But you damn well better earn it." Then he returned to hammering. Bixby didn't answer. He didn't need to. As days passed, travelers came. Whispers had ridden faster than horses ever could. Folks from up north, across the ridges, and beyond the canyons came through Calico Ridge just to stare at the street where it happened. Some sat in the saloon and pointed to the marks on the walls. Others circled the blacksmith's forge, pretending to be interested in horseshoes while trying to catch a glimpse of the men who'd done it. They always asked the same thing. "Is it true?" they'd say. "Did a blacksmith really kill the Cutter gang?" The townsfolk never answered right away. They'd glance toward the forge, where Elias worked with the boy, both of them dark with sweat and flame, speaking only through glances and the language of iron. Then they'd smile. And they'd say, No, but a dead man did. The boy learned quick. He mirrored Elias's movements, learned the patience in waiting for metal to glow the right color, learned that strength wasn't in swinging harder, but in knowing where to strike. In time, the people began to bring their tools and horses not just for the blacksmith, but for the boy. They called him Eli, out of habit or maybe in honor. Elias never corrected them. Each night, when the fire was banked and the street had gone quiet, Elias would take a slow walk behind the forge. The boy watched once but never followed again. Some places weren't meant for company. The grave had changed. Not in shape, not in stone. Still marked only by that flattened horseshoe, rusted now with time. But the earth felt less heavy, the silence less bitter. Elias stood over it, hands clasped behind his back, the duster shifting in the breeze. The night air smelled of rain again, but the sky held its breath. From his coat, he pulled the tin badge. It had dulled even more. The blood stain on its edge had darkened, almost invisible now. He turned it over once, then knelt beside the grave. 6 men, he said softly. All with names. All with sins. But not one of them knew what you carried. His voice cracked then. Just slightly. You carried hope, Mason. You thought peace could live where bullets used to sleep. You believed this land could be better. He placed the badge gently on the earth, tucking it beneath the edge of the horseshoe like one might tuck a blanket under a sleeping child. I wore your name, he said. And maybe I ruined it. But for a little while, I think I kept your soul. He stood slowly, knees stiff, back heavy with the years he'd spent hiding. Then he whispered, almost too low for the wind to carry, the gunslinger rests. The blacksmith lives. A shooting star cut across the sky above the mesa, silent as breath. The forge behind him glowed faintly, its last coals burning down. And in Calico Ridge, beneath that wide and watching sky, the night folded around Elias Mason like a story coming to its end.